David Roberts had always been a man of control. A former Special Forces soldier, he was used to surviving the harshest of conditions, facing death without a second thought. But nothing could have prepared him for the day his protective instincts were tested in ways he never imagined. It all began when he was assigned to work as head of security at a high-profile tech conference, a routine job that turned into a nightmare. When Charlotte Harrington, the daughter of Sophie Harrington, the CEO of one of the world's leading tech companies, was kidnapped right before his eyes, everything changed. What began as a simple case of money-hungry criminals seeking ransom soon spiraled into something much darker. The people behind the kidnapping were not just after money, they were playing a much more dangerous game, one that involved the highest echelons of corporate power. As David uncovered secrets and hidden alliances, he realized that Charlotte wasn't the only one in danger. Now, David must rely on his military skills and unyielding resolve to navigate a treacherous world of corruption, betrayal, and hidden enemies. The question was no longer whether he could save Charlotte. The real question was, who else was he willing to sacrifice to ensure her safety? David Roberts stood at the back of the event hall, observing with the practiced eyes of a former soldier. The room buzzed with energy, filled with tech moguls, investors, and executives from some of the world's largest companies. His job was simple: ensure the safety of everyone inside. His daughter, Anna, was safe at home, far from the chaos of corporate life. She was his world, the only thing that mattered after losing his wife, Sarah, in a military operation that had changed the course of his life forever. David's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Sophie Harrington, the CEO of the tech giant that was sponsoring the event. She walked in with confidence, her tall frame cutting through the crowd like a force of nature. Sophie had built her company from the ground up, and her reputation was impeccable. But today, something felt off. The air was thick, with the weight of something David couldn't quite place. He had seen too many dangerous situations in his life to ignore the gut feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an emergency alarm, an unexpected sound in a setting that should have been under complete control. Sophie's daughter, Charlotte, was at the event with her mother, attending as a special guest. At 25, Charlotte had inherited her mother's sharp mind and was quickly making her own name in the tech world. But unlike Sophie, Charlotte was still learning to navigate the complexities of the world her mother had mastered. David was just a few steps away when the chaos erupted. A group of masked men burst into the conference hall, guns drawn. And within seconds, they had seized Charlotte. Sophie froze in shock, her face pale as the kidnappers dragged her daughter toward the exit. The room erupted into panic. But David's military training kicked in. In a blur of motion, he moved toward the kidnappers, his instincts sharp and focused. But it was too late. Charlotte was already out of sight. Sophie's voice rang out in desperation. "Save her! Please!" David, not waiting for further orders, immediately sprang into action. He pushed through the crowd, his mind calculating every possible outcome as he pursued the kidnappers. David knew this wasn't a typical kidnapping. These men weren't just after money. They had a plan, one that David would need to unravel quickly if he wanted to save Charlotte. As the police arrived and began to piece together what had happened, David used his connections and military resources to investigate further. The first clue came when he intercepted a phone call between one of the kidnappers and an unknown figure. The conversation revealed a surprising twist. The kidnappers weren't just looking for a ransom. They were targeting the Harrington family as part of a larger corporate power struggle. The truth hit David like a punch to the gut. The kidnapping wasn't random. Charlotte was just a pawn in a much larger game. David dug deeper, using his skills as a former intelligence officer to trace the kidnappers' movements. He discovered that Sophie's business dealings with rival companies had put her at odds with powerful individuals who were willing to do anything to destroy her. And Charlotte's kidnapping was just the beginning. Sophie, too, was unknowingly involved in a far more dangerous web than she could have ever imagined. David had no time to lose. With the help of a few trusted allies from his military days, he began to formulate a plan to track down the kidnappers. His first move was to infiltrate a safe house he believed the kidnappers were using. The operation would be dangerous, but David had no choice. Charlotte's life depended on it. As he prepared for the mission, Sophie, desperate to help, insisted on joining him. David hesitated at first. Sophie wasn't trained for something like this. But there was no time to argue. They needed to move quickly. Together, they ventured into the heart of the criminal network. David led the way, using his combat skills to eliminate threats and protect Sophie from harm. But the deeper they went, the more treacherous the situation became. They were up against enemies who were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. Just as they were closing in on the kidnappers, David's team was ambushed. One of his closest allies had betrayed him, revealing their location to the enemy. Sophie was nearly captured in the chaos, but David fought tooth and nail to keep her safe. It became clear that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. As David faced off with the traitor, Sophie uncovered the true extent of the conspiracy. The kidnappers were working for a rival tech company that had been secretly backing illegal operations to destabilize Harrington's empire. It wasn't just about Charlotte anymore, it was about power, control, and a war that had been brewing in the shadows for years. The final confrontation took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension as David and Sophie prepared to face the kidnappers and their powerful allies. Sophie, no longer just the CEO, had become a vital part of the mission. Her sharp intellect and determination were her greatest weapons. The battle that followed was brutal. David and Sophie fought side by side, using every skill they had to outsmart and overpower the enemy. As the last of the kidnappers fell, Charlotte was finally freed. But the fight wasn't over. The mastermind behind the operation, the CEO of the rival tech company, was still out there, ready to strike again. With Charlotte safely returned to her mother, the conspiracy unraveled. Sophie took control of the situation, using her influence and power to bring the criminals to justice. But the events had changed her forever. No longer just a businesswoman, Sophie had become a warrior in her own right. David, too, had changed. He had saved Charlotte, but in doing so, he had discovered something about himself. He could still fight, still protect, and still love fiercely. As he walked away from the chaos, he knew one thing for certain: his daughter Anna would never face a world where he wasn't there to protect her. And as for Sophie and Charlotte, their lives would never be the same. They had both learned that family came before everything else, even the most powerful corporations. The days following Charlotte's rescue felt surreal. The chaotic, adrenaline-charged events of the last few days left everyone drained, both physically and mentally. Sophie, still processing the fact that her daughter had been in danger, struggled to regain her composure. Charlotte, though shaken, was eager to return to her life. But David knew, deep in his gut, that the danger wasn't truly over. He had seen too much in his military career to trust that the dust would settle this easily. The investigation into the kidnapping, now publicly acknowledged as a corporate conspiracy, had taken a major turn. As the criminal network began to disband, a new, more sinister presence began to emerge. Despite the takedown of the kidnappers and the rival company's connections being exposed, a darker force loomed behind the scenes. David received an encrypted message late one night, a name he didn't recognize. Thomas Kincaid. The message simply read, "You've only just scratched the surface. He knows who you are, and he's coming for you." David sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, the weight of the words pressing on him. Who was Kincaid, and how did he know about him? More importantly, why was he involved in this mess? David had been in enough fights to recognize when something was off, and this was one of those times. The game had shifted from kidnappers and corrupt business moguls to something far more dangerous, an enemy he hadn't seen coming. A few days later, Thomas Kincaid made his move. The mysterious figure had been pulling strings in the background, orchestrating the whole affair from the shadows. David tracked him down to an old, dilapidated mansion outside the city, a place abandoned by time, but not by the secrets it kept. As David and Sophie arrived at the location, they could feel the tension mounting. There were no guards, no obvious signs of activity, just the eerie silence of an abandoned estate. Kincaid was a man who knew how to hide in plain sight. His wealth and influence allowed him to manipulate both the criminal underworld and corporate powerhouses, and it seemed he had been doing so for years. David had to dig deeper into Kincaid's history, uncovering a trail of deceit, corruption, and ruthless ambition. The more David learned, the more dangerous Kincaid seemed. He wasn't just a man out for power, he was a man bent on controlling everything and everyone in his path. As David and Sophie stood at the gates of the mansion, they could feel the storm approaching. Kincaid knew they were coming, and he was ready. The moment David stepped inside the mansion, he realized that Kincaid had been waiting for him. The grand chandelier overhead seemed to mock him with its cold crystal gleam, and the silence in the halls was suffocating. Sophie stayed close, but David could sense that she was nervous. This wasn't the kind of place where power was simply wielded. This was a place where lives were destroyed, manipulated, and crushed under the weight of one man's ambition. "David Roberts," Kincaid's voice echoed from the shadows. "You're exactly what I expected. A soldier, a protector, but not a man who knows how to play in the big leagues." David's grip tightened on his gun, but he remained calm. "This isn't about games, Kincaid. You're out of moves. I'll take you down, just like the others." Kincaid stepped forward from the shadows, his cold eyes narrowing in amusement. "You think you're the hero in this story? You think saving the girl is your victory?" He let out a humorless laugh. "You've played right into my hands. Your little rescue? It only bought me time. You've done exactly what I needed you to do." David's mind raced. It was clear now that Kincaid wasn't just after Charlotte. He was using everything and everyone to get closer to his ultimate goal. "What do you want?" David demanded, his voice steady but laced with anger. Kincaid smiled. "I want control. The world doesn't run on good intentions, Roberts. It runs on power. And now, I have you right where I want you." Before David could react, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Kincaid's men had arrived, and they weren't alone. The situation had escalated far beyond anything David had anticipated. Sophie quickly pulled out a hidden weapon, something she had been prepared with after all she'd learned through this ordeal. A fierce battle broke out inside the mansion. David and Sophie fought side by side, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of survival and the drive to protect their loved ones. Sophie, though untrained in combat, had become resourceful. Her time spent working in the cutthroat world of business had given her a mind as sharp as a blade, and she was using it to outwit their enemies at every turn. David's combat training took over as he systematically dismantled Kincaid's men, moving with precision and deadly accuracy. But as the fight raged on, it became clear that they were outnumbered. Kincaid had set the stage, and they were now in the final act of his twisted game. Just when David thought they had the upper hand, Kincaid revealed his trump card. He had captured Anna, David's daughter, using her as leverage. His cold, calculating voice echoed through the mansion. "Let's see if you're truly a father, Roberts. You have to choose. Your daughter, or your life." David's heart stopped. The stakes had never been higher. As David stood, breathing heavily, staring down the barrel of Kincaid's gun, his mind raced. He knew what he had to do. He had been a soldier, trained to face the unthinkable. But this was personal. His family. The only thing in his life that mattered. Kincaid's laughter filled the room as he taunted David, pushing him to make a choice. But David had always been a man of resolve, and he wasn't about to let Kincaid control him any longer. He was a protector, a father, and no one, no matter how powerful, would take that from him. In a split second, David made his move. He disarmed Kincaid's men with precision, disabling the threat in mere moments. Sophie, who had already taken out 2 of Kincaid's guards, shot the final assailant, ensuring their safety. And in that single instant, David rushed to Anna's side, pulling her into his arms. Kincaid was defeated, his empire crumbling as law enforcement swarmed the mansion. His reign of terror had come to an end. Days after the confrontation, as David, Sophie, Charlotte, and Anna sat together in the quiet of their home, the weight of the ordeal began to settle. They had all been changed by the events that had unfolded. Sophie, now more protective of her daughter than ever, had learned the true cost of ambition. Charlotte, scarred but stronger, had gained a newfound respect for the family bonds that had always existed but had never been fully understood. And David, finally able to hold his daughter in his arms, knew that he had done the impossible. He had protected his family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The mansion lay in ruins, its once grand halls now echoing with the sounds of police sirens and distant chatter. The aftermath of the brutal fight with Kincaid and his men had left everyone involved reeling, but for David, the fight wasn't over yet. He could still feel the weight of his decision to protect Anna, to put everything on the line for his family. But now, the dust was settling. Kincaid was arrested, and his network of criminal operatives was being taken down piece by piece. But David knew this wasn't the last he'd see of the dark web of power Kincaid had woven. The fear of retribution loomed, but so did a deeper sense of loss. The consequences of the battle weren't just physical. They were psychological. David sat alone in a small, dimly lit room in the mansion, staring out the window. Sophie had gone to check on Charlotte, who was still processing the terror she'd endured. David's thoughts raced back to the moment when Kincaid had held Anna hostage, forcing him into a heart-wrenching decision. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fear in his daughter's eyes, the helplessness in her voice. But he also saw the strength, how, even in the face of peril, Anna had shown resilience, just like her mother. The thought brought a strange sense of comfort amidst the chaos. That night, David lay awake in the hotel room, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the memories. The fight with Kincaid's men had been brutal, but it was the final choice, the one involving Anna, that haunted him. Every moment of fear and doubt, the split-second decision, had felt like a lifetime. The heavy weight of responsibility, as a father and protector, was a burden David was only now beginning to understand. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back each time. More vivid than before. He had seen too many lives lost in his military career, too many sacrifices made, and yet the choice to protect his family had felt different. It felt personal, and for the first time in years, David realized that he might not be able to do this alone. He needed Sophie, Charlotte, Anna, his family, the people he fought for. The following days were a blur of interviews, police reports, and constant updates from law enforcement. Sophie had taken charge of the aftermath, her CEO instincts kicking in as she dealt with the corporate side of the situation. But privately, she was a mess. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the moment when Charlotte had been taken, when she'd been powerless. Sophie had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control. But now, the weight of her own vulnerability crushed her. She hadn't been able to protect her daughter in that moment, and the guilt gnawed at her. But what Sophie didn't expect was for David to be there. It had been a long time since she'd leaned on anyone. But in the days following Charlotte's rescue, Sophie found herself turning to David, seeking comfort in his strength. There was something about him, something unshakable that made her feel safe, even when the world around them was falling apart. She didn't know what it was, but in the quiet moments when they weren't talking, just being near him helped her breathe easier. One evening, as they sat in a small cafe near the mansion, Sophie finally spoke up. "I don't know how to deal with this. I thought I had everything under control. But now, I don't even know where to start." David looked at her, his expression serious yet understanding. "You don't have to do this alone. We're in this together." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Sophie realized, in that moment, that David wasn't just a protector. He was a partner, in a way she had never allowed herself to experience. She had built her empire alone, fought her battles alone. But this was different, and it felt like a beginning. Charlotte, for all her bravery during the kidnapping, was struggling in ways her mother couldn't quite grasp. She had always been the confident, capable daughter of a powerful CEO. But now, the trauma of being kidnapped, the fear, and the helplessness were overwhelming her. Sophie knew something was wrong, but Charlotte hadn't said a word about it. She was trying to pretend it hadn't affected her, but Sophie could see through the facade. One evening, after Charlotte had been quiet for hours, Sophie finally cornered her in her room. "Charlotte, we need to talk." Charlotte hesitated, her eyes avoiding her mother's gaze. "There's nothing to talk about," she muttered. But Sophie could tell that something was eating away at her. "You're not fine. I can see it. You don't have to be strong all the time, Charlotte," Sophie said softly, sitting down beside her daughter on the bed. The walls Charlotte had built around herself began to crack. She broke down in her mother's arms, crying for the first time since the kidnapping. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't know how to be okay again." Sophie held her tight, whispering reassuring words. "We'll get through this. Together." Weeks passed, but the shadow of Kincaid's empire still loomed over them. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, it was clear that Kincaid had been only one piece of a larger puzzle. David's contacts in law enforcement had informed him that Kincaid's influence stretched far beyond what anyone had realized. Sophie's business dealings, while legally sound, had attracted enemies who now saw her as a threat to their own power. The war was far from over. The last thing David wanted was for Sophie and her family to be dragged back into this mess. But he knew they had no choice. The conspiracy Kincaid had orchestrated was far-reaching, and it wouldn't be long before new enemies would rise to take his place. They needed to be prepared for the worst. After several days of tense discussions with law enforcement, corporate allies, and military contacts, David and Sophie reached a crucial decision. Sophie would take her company public, using the pressure from the ongoing situation to strengthen her position. But in doing so, they would have to expose some of the most dangerous secrets of the criminal network they had just uncovered. David's role would be more than just a bodyguard. He would help her navigate the treacherous waters of corporate espionage, using his connections and military background to ensure their safety. But this time, there was no going back. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. As they prepared for the next phase of their plan, Sophie and David exchanged a look, a silent agreement. They were no longer just fighting for Charlotte's safety or for their own. They were fighting for something much larger. Control over their lives, their families, and their futures. The enemy wasn't just in the shadows now. They were coming for everything. But Sophie, David, and Charlotte had come out of the darkness before. And they would, again. The final confrontation wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming their lives. As David stood with Sophie in the final moments of their battle, the feeling of dread lifted. Together, they had uncovered the depths of the conspiracy. Now, it was time to end it. With Charlotte safely by their side and the strength of their family behind them, they took the fight to the very heart of the corrupt forces that had threatened their existence. They were no longer pawns in a game, they were the masters of their own destiny. Weeks had passed since David and Sophie made their decision to expose the criminal network lurking within the corporate world. And now, as the clock ticked down to the final moments of their battle, the weight of their decisions pressed heavily upon them. Their plan had evolved into something bigger than they could have anticipated. No longer just about protecting Charlotte or maintaining their business. It was about reclaiming their lives from the sinister forces that had tried to tear them apart. Sophie sat in her office, meticulously reviewing the documents that would expose the corporate conspiracy. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, thoughts racing as she prepared to pull the trigger on a deal that would forever change her company. David, now fully integrated into her team, stood by her side, watching her every move with unwavering support. There were no secrets between them now. They had become partners not just in survival, but in a war they were ready to finish. "We're almost there," Sophie said, her voice tight with tension. She'd seen countless challenges in her career, but none quite like this. The enemy they were facing was far more dangerous than she'd realized. And while she had always been confident in her abilities, the pressure of the situation had taken its toll. But the fear was not just hers, it was shared. David placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the reassurance only he could provide. "We've made it this far. We just need to hold on a little longer. We'll finish what we started." Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath before finalizing the deal that would send shockwaves through the corporate world. With a single click, she sent the files to the press and to the relevant authorities. It was a gamble, an enormous one, but it was the only move they had left. The fallout from Sophie's decision came faster than anyone could have predicted. The very same night the files were leaked, their phones began ringing non-stop. The news was everywhere. Headlines screamed about the criminal syndicate that had infiltrated major corporations and manipulated the business world for years. The files contained irrefutable proof of the shady dealings, hidden financial backdoors, and the involvement of some of the most powerful figures in business. Sophie's company was at the center of the storm, but with the exposure came retaliation. As the authorities closed in, desperate to cover their tracks, the remaining members of the syndicate began to target Sophie directly. Their reach was long, and their influence was vast. They had resources too many to count, and now it was personal. Sophie had made an enemy of the most dangerous people in the world. David and Sophie's phones rang simultaneously, both displaying the same number. A cryptic message from an unknown source. "You've made a mistake. It's not over. We're coming for you." "Who is this?" David muttered. But he already knew the answer. There was only one person who could orchestrate this level of chaos. Thomas Kincaid. Kincaid's absence from the last few weeks hadn't been accidental. He had been laying low, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Now it was clear. He was playing his final hand. David's eyes hardened as he glanced at Sophie. "We need to move. Now." David knew Kincaid wasn't the kind of person who would go down easily. His network was vast, and even though most of his operations had been exposed, there were still lingering threats hiding in the shadows. David had made it a point to infiltrate every part of Kincaid's organization, but even he couldn't predict how deep the rabbit hole went. The night air was thick with tension as David and Sophie made their way through the streets, avoiding detection. They had no choice but to go underground. The authorities were already on high alert, and it was only a matter of time before they would come for Sophie. But the enemy they faced now wasn't just a matter of corporate greed, it was a matter of survival. As they neared an undisclosed location, a phone rang again. This time, it was Charlotte. "Dad, Mom, are you okay?" Her voice was laced with worry. David's heart sank. "We're fine, sweetheart. But you need to stay with your grandmother for a few days. Do you understand?" Charlotte hesitated. "What's going on?" "It's complicated," David said gently. "But we need you to be safe. Promise me you'll stay hidden until we come back." "I promise, Dad." David ended the call, but his mind raced. The weight of his family's safety, of the mission they were on, had never felt heavier. Sophie stood beside him, her gaze focused and determined, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. This fight was taking its toll on her, just as it was on him. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked, breaking his thoughts. "We've got one last stop. Kincaid isn't done, and we need to find him before he makes his move." They entered a safe house, a place David had set up months ago, just in case this day ever came. The place was unassuming, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. David quickly began setting up equipment to track Kincaid's movements. Sophie took a seat nearby, reviewing the documents once more. They needed to be sharp. There was no room for mistakes. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Through their network of contacts and David's military resources, they discovered that Kincaid had set up an operation in an old industrial complex, miles outside the city. It was an abandoned manufacturing plant, perfect for hiding out without raising suspicion. "This is it," David muttered, preparing his gear. His hand brushed over the weapon belt at his waist, the familiar weight grounding him. "This ends tonight." Sophie nodded, but she didn't speak. She was in full CEO mode, now focused, calculating, determined. She had spent her entire life building her empire, and she wasn't about to let it crumble because of one man's greed. As they approached the industrial complex, the sky above them seemed to darken, clouds gathering as if the world itself was bracing for the final battle. David's eyes scanned the area, every movement, every shadow. They were walking into the heart of the beast. They moved silently, a practiced unit. Sophie stayed close behind David, her senses on high alert. As they reached the entrance of the building, the door creaked open. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the night, it felt deafening. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Every corner seemed to hide a secret, every shadow potentially deadly. They crept through the halls, using their knowledge of Kincaid's tactics to stay one step ahead. The building seemed deserted, but David knew better. Kincaid was never far. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, Kincaid himself. "Did you really think you could take me down so easily?" Kincaid's voice echoed in the dark, dripping with arrogance. David's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. Sophie stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear she must have felt. "You're finished, Kincaid. We're not letting you get away with this." Kincaid's smile widened. "You've lost, Sophie. I'm always 2 steps ahead of you. Always." David's eyes narrowed. Not this time. With a swift motion, he dove into action, taking Kincaid's men down one by one. His movements precise and lethal. Sophie followed, her business acumen now serving her in the chaos. She dodged and maneuvered through the building, staying by David's side as they fought their way toward the heart of the complex where Kincaid waited. In the final confrontation, David faced Kincaid alone. The room was cold, dimly lit by the flickering light overhead. Kincaid stood by a control panel, his fingers hovering over buttons that could change the course of everything. "You won't stop me," Kincaid snarled, his hand reaching for a detonator. "This is the end of your little game." David didn't hesitate. He dove toward Kincaid, his hand connecting with the man's jaw in a brutal punch. But Kincaid, always prepared, was faster. A struggle ensued, violent, desperate, as both men fought for control. Sophie arrived just in time to see David disarm Kincaid, the detonator falling from his hand. She ran forward, grabbing Kincaid by the collar. "You're done," she spat. David and Sophie exchanged a look, one that said everything. They had won. As Kincaid was taken away by authorities, the weight of their victory settled over David, Sophie, and Charlotte. They had come through the darkness together, stronger than ever before. David looked at his family, his heart swelling with pride. They had fought for their future, for each other. And in the end, they had won. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, they could finally breathe. In the aftermath of Kincaid's arrest, the city seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Headlines buzzed with the capture of the criminal mastermind who had infiltrated the highest levels of business and corruption. Sophie's company was hailed for its transparency, and the public's trust in her grew stronger. But beneath the surface, the battle was far from over. David, Sophie, Charlotte, and Anna spent their days in the days after the chaos, trying to return to some semblance of normality. Sophie worked tirelessly to rebuild her company's reputation while focusing on securing her family's safety. Charlotte, though still recovering from the trauma of the kidnapping, was slowly finding her strength again. And Anna, ever the protector, kept a watchful eye on her sister. Yet, David knew better than to believe that their fight was over. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to think that Kincaid's arrest would end the danger. Kincaid may have been one part of the puzzle, but the network of corrupt individuals he had cultivated was vast. The city had barely begun to uncover the true scope of Kincaid's operations. It wasn't long before David's fears were confirmed. One evening, while Sophie was in a high-level meeting with her board of directors, David received an anonymous message. "You haven't seen the end yet. There's more coming. Be ready." His instincts went into overdrive. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. They were watching Sophie. Watching them all. With Kincaid out of the picture, there had to be another player waiting in the wings. Someone who had learned from Kincaid's mistakes and was determined not to fall into the same traps. David immediately contacted his trusted allies in law enforcement. He didn't want to alarm Sophie just yet, he needed more information. But the more he dug, the more he realized how connected this new player was to the remnants of Kincaid's syndicate. There were whispers of a man named Victor Hayes, a former business mogul whose empire had collapsed years ago due to Kincaid's manipulation. Hayes had since vanished, but it appeared he was very much alive and plotting a new course for revenge. While David began to investigate further, Sophie's life seemed to return to normal, albeit with heightened security. She couldn't help but feel the weight of her decisions. She had been forced into the spotlight during the crisis, and while she had come out on top, the toll it had taken on her personal life was immense. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the next shoe would drop. David noticed her restlessness. They had been through so much together. And though their bond had grown stronger, he could see the strain in her eyes. Sophie was a warrior, but even the strongest needed time to heal. "How are you holding up?" David asked one evening, sitting beside her on the balcony. Sophie glanced at him, a tired smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm managing, I think." David's eyes softened. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. You've been through more than anyone should. But we're in this together. Always." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, finding solace in his presence. "I just wish it would all stop. I want to move on from all of this. But it feels like we're being dragged back into it every time we try." David didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know when or if the danger would ever stop. But he had made a vow to protect her, Charlotte, and Anna. And he would honor that vow, no matter the cost. Days passed, and the quiet that had followed Kincaid's arrest started to feel like a fragile illusion. The whispers of Victor Hayes grew louder, and David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He doubled his efforts, diving into the shadows of the criminal underworld, searching for any sign of Hayes' return. It was then that he received a tip from one of his informants. Hayes was preparing to strike, and his target was Sophie. The information was vague, but David didn't need the details to know that Hayes was playing the same dangerous game Kincaid had played. He acted quickly. Sophie was to be kept in seclusion until they could track Hayes down. But Sophie, as always, was not one to sit idle. She refused to let fear control her life again. "I won't hide, David," she said firmly, her jaw set in determination. "If we're going to face this, we do it together. Not from behind closed doors." David knew better than to argue. Sophie was strong, but he couldn't ignore the danger that lay ahead. They couldn't risk losing her again. The two of them went on the offensive, tracking down every lead. But what they didn't anticipate was the trap Hayes had set for them, one that was as personal as it was deadly. The trap was sprung when David and Sophie were lured into a high-profile charity gala that Sophie was scheduled to attend. It had seemed like the perfect opportunity to publicly show the world that she was moving on from the chaos, something they both desperately needed. But it was a facade. It was too quiet, too perfect. David's instincts flared as soon as they entered the venue. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his mind raced as he scanned the room. Something was wrong. He subtly signaled to Sophie, but it was too late. A masked figure appeared from the shadows, and before David could react, Sophie was grabbed from behind, a sharp object pressed against her throat. "Don't move," a cold voice hissed. David's heart pounded in his chest, but his training kicked in. Without hesitation, he dove toward Sophie, using his body as a shield. The figure didn't hesitate. There was a brief struggle before David wrestled the assailant to the ground, but the damage was done. Sophie was shaken, her breath ragged as she looked at him. "Who did this?" Sophie gasped, clutching her neck. David's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "It's not over, Sophie." David's blood ran cold as he turned to see Victor Hayes, standing in the shadows, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "This time, it's personal," Hayes continued. "You're mine now." Victor Hayes' appearance marked the beginning of a new chapter in this deadly game. Unlike Kincaid, who had been a force of raw ambition and corporate manipulation, Hayes was a master of psychological warfare. He knew how to make people crumble without ever raising a finger. But David was no amateur. He knew the rules of this game, and he wasn't about to let Hayes take his family from him again. The battle for Sophie's safety and for the future of their family was just beginning. David looked at Sophie, his jaw clenched, eyes full of determination. "We'll stop him." Together, Sophie nodded, her fear replaced with fierce resolve. "We're not running anymore. This ends with him." And so, their final fight began. But in a game as dangerous as the one they were playing, they knew they couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The stakes had never been higher. The tension in the air was palpable as David, Sophie, and their closest allies gathered in the dimly lit safe house, preparing for what could be the final confrontation with Victor Hayes. They had already lost too much, and Sophie couldn't afford to let anyone else get hurt, least of all her family. David had been on high alert ever since the gala, where Hayes had made his presence known in the most brutal way. But now, it was time to end this once and for all. David stood by the window, his hand clenched into a fist, his thoughts racing. The city outside felt distant, disconnected from the urgent battle unfolding in the shadows. Sophie, ever the strategist, had spent the last few hours piecing together what they knew about Hayes. She was driven, her eyes sharp. But David could tell it wasn't just her usual business acumen at play. Now, it was personal. The fear she had tried so hard to suppress over the past few weeks had finally surfaced. Hayes had pushed her to the edge, and she was no longer running from the fight. She was ready to face him head-on. "We have to do this carefully," David said, his voice low but determined. "Hayes is dangerous, and he's playing with our minds. We can't let him control the narrative." Sophie nodded. "I know. I've never felt this. Exposed. He's not just trying to destroy my company. He's trying to destroy everything we've built. Everything we stand for. I won't let him." David met her gaze, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "We'll make sure that doesn't happen. You've already shown the world what you're made of. Now we finish it together." Sophie smiled faintly, her confidence returning. She had come a long way from the woman who had been so overwhelmed by the challenges of running a massive corporation while keeping her family safe. Now, Sophie Harrington wasn't just a CEO. She was a mother and a warrior, and she would do whatever it took to protect the ones she loved. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would lure Hayes out of hiding by exploiting his biggest weakness, his desire for control. The bait was Sophie herself. She would use her position, her reputation, to draw Hayes into a public confrontation. They knew he couldn't resist the chance to humiliate her, to take her down in front of the world. But Sophie wouldn't be alone. David, with his military precision and combat experience, would be by her side every step of the way. They would act as a team, their strength in unity. The rest of their allies, people who had supported them through the chaos, were positioned throughout the city, ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. The night was set for the final battle. The press conference where Sophie would address the public and announce the truth about the crimes Victor Hayes had orchestrated would be their battlefield. It was a risky move, but it was their only shot at drawing Hayes out into the open. As the time for the conference approached, Sophie and David stood backstage, watching the journalists file into the auditorium. The tension between them was thick, but it was no longer fear. It was resolve. They knew that after this night, nothing would be the same. They either ended this battle, or Hayes would finish what Kincaid started. "Are you ready?" David asked, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the moment. Sophie looked at him, her eyes fierce with determination. "Let's finish this." The press conference was underway. Sophie stood at the podium, calm and composed, delivering her speech to the crowd. Her voice rang out across the room, telling the truth about the extent of Victor Hayes' involvement in the criminal syndicate, detailing his manipulations, and revealing the secrets he had kept hidden for so long. The media was captivated, and the weight of Sophie's words carried a power that made even the most hardened journalists stop and listen. But then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The doors to the auditorium creaked open, and a shadowed figure stepped inside. Victor Hayes. "Did you really think you could expose me, Sophie?" Hayes' voice echoed through the room, cold and filled with venom. He stepped into the light, his eyes locking onto hers. "You may have the press, but you don't have the power." "Not anymore." David moved instinctively, stepping to the side of the stage, positioning himself between Sophie and Hayes. He knew what was coming next. This wasn't just about words anymore. It was about a fight for survival. The tension exploded in an instant. Hayes lunged at Sophie, but David was faster. In one fluid motion, he tackled Hayes, slamming him into the ground. The room erupted into chaos as security scrambled. But the fight had already begun. David's training took over as he pinned Hayes to the ground, his grip tight around the man's throat. But Hayes was no slouch. He fought back, with a fury that matched David's. The two men struggled, each one trying to overpower the other, each determined to come out on top. Sophie watched the scene unfold, her heart racing. But this was her fight too. She wasn't just the victim anymore. She was the woman who had fought to rebuild her life, her company, and her family. And now, she was going to take control. Sophie stepped forward, her gaze steady, and pulled a gun from her jacket. It was a calculated risk, but she knew that if this was going to end, it had to end now. "Enough," Sophie shouted, her voice unwavering. "Victor, this ends tonight." Hayes froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and fear. He had underestimated Sophie, and now she had the upper hand. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. David stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You lost, Hayes," he said, his voice cold but triumphant. "Your game is over." Hayes glared at them, but it was clear he had been beaten. The fight was over, and Sophie had won. The media storm that followed was unlike anything Sophie had ever experienced. Her name was in every headline, and the world watched as she and David emerged victorious. Hayes was arrested, his criminal empire dismantled, and the truth was finally out in the open. But for Sophie, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about her family, her safety, and her future. David and Sophie stood together, looking out over the city they had fought so hard to protect. The danger had passed, for now. But they both knew that peace was fleeting. They had won the battle, but there would always be new challenges ahead. "What now?" Sophie asked, her voice soft but hopeful. David smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "Now, we take it one day at a time." Together, they stood there for a long moment, knowing that they had overcome the greatest threat to their family and their lives. They had been through hell and back, but in the end, they were stronger for it. And no matter what the future held, they would face it as a team.